I've always taken as my mantra the William Faulkner's words in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he said, the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about.
Throughout all of human history, all around the world, whether drawn on the walls of caves, passed down through oral tradition, or written down to stand the test of time, we as a species have been telling and retelling each other stories. Stories that tell us where we come from, where we're going, stories that tell us of heroes and villains, of myths and monsters, love and war, laughter and pain, stories about ourselves, told to each other, and then told again. If our blood and our genes tell us what we are, our stories tell us who we are. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is listening to their story. As a game that centers around a world co-created by legendary game director Hidetaka Miyazaki and the fantasy author titan George R. R. Martin, Elden Ring is a lot of things, but most importantly, it is a story that lends itself to being told. The works of Martin and Miyazaki have both found a way to capture audiences with their use of environmental storytelling that build rich and complex fantasy worlds which are delicately interwoven into the tales of character drama that sometimes spans generations, all the while being the backdrops for otherworldly mysteries in a way that an entire culture and even industry has developed into retelling and sharing their stories. Forums, message boards, chat rooms, and hours upon hours of videos dedicated to analyzing, breaking down, and explaining their works forever and ever, even if nobody else is watching or listening. Most importantly, though, are people sharing what they think about these stories, what they mean, and what they're trying to tell us. That is something so uniquely human. Miyazaki and Martin tell their stories in very distinctive ways, not just respectively of each other, but even within their own spaces. George R. R. Martin is a meticulous writer who crafts his stories in a way that lends themselves to being rewarding rereads. A Song of Ice and Fire is a prime example of this. Each chapter is told from the point of view of one of the dozens of characters throughout the series, each of them with their own unique histories, perspectives, personalities, and stories. You cannot get the whole picture of what's going on just by reading the chapters of one of the characters, because each character only knows as much as they know. Seemingly insignificant details, repeated imagery, references, prophecies, and cryptic writing all tie together in telling the story. But it's up to the reader to piece things together between each of these perspectives to paint the full picture. It's up to us to figure out what it all means. The craftsmanship he uses to make sure that nothing is out of place, that everything fits into this fantasy world he has created, is a marvel to behold, though the wait for the last 2 books have been a long one because of it. Not all stories are about their endings, though, and the story that Martin has told so far, and shared with all of us, has done what he has set out to do, and more than he could ever imagine. Even if the story doesn't have an ending, I think it's one of the greatest stories ever told. Miyazaki's games are much the same way, in success and acclaim, but even so with how they tell their stories. Although video games require dozens to even hundreds of people to create, Miyazaki employs a method of control he calls total direction, where the designers are given a great amount of freedom, but Miyazaki gets a final say on all design choices. He will take a very direct approach in some design choices to make sure the story he wants told is present in game. In the Dark Souls Design Works interview, designer Daisuke Satake tells how Miyazaki would go so far as to act out the hand movements for Gravelord Nito and the Ashen Maiden for the introduction cutscene to make sure they were perfect. The movement of these characters is so important to Miyazaki that he will direct the action down to their fingers. While collaborative pieces of art, Miyazaki's games are firmly his vision. In his stories, the player character is always in control. The story is always told from their perspective, and the worlds they travel to are hostile and won't willingly share their secrets. Sometimes it isn't just the worlds these stories take place in, but the stories themselves. More so than any other piece of art I've seen is there a need for people to understand what is actually happening in Miyazaki's games. The opaque nature and how the games tell their stories make it so that reading their narratives can be almost as challenging as playing the games themselves. Information about these worlds and their histories are hidden in the descriptions of items and where those items are found, how the digital castles and statues are designed, and in between the lines of character dialogue. It's up to the player to act as a fantasy anthropologist to figure out how old something is in these worlds, what the purpose of the rituals and customs were, and what your character actually does with any of the fantasy MacGuffins they're set out to chase. Even the characters who exist in these worlds will actively mislead and sometimes lie directly to the player character. And generally, if one character says another character is lying, they're doing so for their own gain, and they may be withholding the truth themselves. But this is all up to the player to figure out. So the marriage of both Martin and Miyazaki was a match made in heaven. And it's no wonder why. Hidetaka Miyazaki has been a long-time fan of George R. R. Martin. Some of Martin's more obscure works like Fever Dream and Tough Voyaging can be found on the shelves next to Japanese manga such as Berserk and Devilman. One is a horror novel that takes place in New Orleans during the American slave trade that follows the conflict of 2 immortal vampires and delves deep into the nature of the evils of men. The other is a science fiction novel that follows one oddball outcast who has one of the few surviving spaceships that has the power to clone and create genetic monstrosities, from dinosaurs, animal-human hybrids, and telepathic cats. He uses this power to solve problems on various planets through ecological chain reactions while being a vehicle to ask hard-hitting questions about morality and the existence of God. Hidetaka Miyazaki being able to make Elden Ring from George R. R. Martin's lore and mythos is not just a dream come true for many of us fans, but I think it was for him too. The collaboration of these two artists has led to a piece of art that I hope can also stand the test of time. I hope that this story persists for others to hear it too. When Martin was a kid growing up in Bayonne, New Jersey, the public housing he lived in wouldn't allow pets like cats or dogs, but they allowed things like turtles. He would tell stories of kings and queens, knights and dragons, how these turtles were plotting against each other, trying to take the throne or turtle shell. Martin has said in interviews that those turtles were the forerunners to a Game of Thrones, and most of the time you can find him wearing his signature turtle pin. Hidetaka Miyazaki also grew up poor, but on the other side of the world in Shizuoka, Japan. He loved reading, especially Western fantasy and science fiction novels. He wasn't completely fluent in reading English, so he would use the images in the books to fill in the gaps and essentially write his own story in his head. Many of his games mimic this experience by only giving the player enough information to be able to decide what is going on, but not enough for it to be completely clear. It's up to the audience to fill in the gaps and finish writing the story. These two aspects of both of their childhoods will go on to be foundational in how they write their stories. With Elden Ring, that marriage is complete, and to prove it, nods to both Martin and Miyazaki can be found in the Church of Vows, the wise old turtle who shares most of the history of the world, and reveals the stories of how the wars of these lands led to one king marrying one queen just to leave her for another queen. Behind him is a statue which harbors a secret. This statue is the only one of its kind in Elden Ring, but she shows her face in Miyazaki's previous games. Only a superfan of both Martin and Miyazaki would know that Muriel is a reference to those dime store turtles in New Jersey, and that this statue isn't depicting Queen Marika the Eternal, but Keitha, goddess of tears, the false name for one feared by gods and worshipped by the undead. Velka, goddess of sin. For each sin, there is a punishment, and it is the task of goddess Velka to define the sin and mete out the punishment. The invisible hand that hovered over Lordran, which brought dark wings, dark words, and a dark world. This is why we retell these stories. When I retell the story of Elden Ring, I like to focus on the themes of remembering, mourning, and healing. And I do that by telling the story of these things. The formless life forms known as silver tears. They're creatures of mimicry. They're shapeshifters, changeling, doppelgangers, skinwalkers. Their names are lies. The faces they wear are not their own. They are no one. But they're not nothing. And I love them. I love them so much, I don't even know how to put it into words. In Elden Ring, you can find them imitating almost anything and everything. Plants, animals, mushrooms, men, monsters, gods, and even fire. They're hidden in plain sight. They're in places you would least expect, and they can look just like you or me. The only way to tell the story of these tears, the only way to reveal these creatures of mimicry, we first have to tell the story of what they're trying to imitate. Elden Ring is a long story. Some say it's the never-ending story. Its world is built with the same depth and complexity of Westeros, but dilapidated and decaying like Lordran. It's a story that requires the careful reading of every line of text, the inspection of almost every decaying castle, a full reading of George R. R. Martin's entire catalog, a complete understanding of every one of Miyazaki's games, multiple playthroughs, again and again, just to understand what exactly is going on. And yet, it doesn't require any of that. All it really takes is as much as you want it to. These tears have been here the whole time. They'll still be here if you see them or not. It's your choice to look. Roughly a third of the way through the game, your character will have to face off with one of these silver tears. And right before your eyes, it'll transform into an exact copy of your character. Whoever they might be, that is who the tear will be. Upon its defeat, your character will be rewarded with the silver tear mask. Mask fashioned from the corpse of a formless silver tear, supported by its hardened, shed husk. Greatly increases arcane to the detriment of physical power. To imitate the imitator is a cunning play indeed. Perhaps that was the answer all along. So let's put on the mask and tell a story. In times like these, what better place to start than at the end?
What's this?
A Song of Ice and Fire. Archmaester Ebro's history of the wars following the death of King Robert. I helped him with the title.
At the very end of Elden Ring, after felling the last of the fire giants, after the flame of ruin is fed its kindling, and the Erd Tree is burned, the Tarnished of no renown is transported to the ancient royal city of Farum Azula, which has been slowly crumbling since time immemorial to unleash the rune of death. By slaying Malekith, Marika's Black Blade, the forbidden shadow destined death is unbound from its prison, and the Tarnished of no renown awakens to a city of ash in a new world where even gods can die. But before the player can finish the game and see the end credits, their Tarnished must contend with others who covet the throne. They fight Godfrey, first Elden Lord, with the Beast Regent Sarash grafted in gold to his back, who has returned from the dead to be granted an audience once more. Halfway through the fight, the truth is revealed. He was no god after all. He isn't even the first Elden Lord, but a simple warrior named Hoarlu. He was chosen by Marika the Eternal for his bestial nature and sheer propensity to commit violence so he could lay waste to all who stood in her way, confine the flame atop the mount, and brandish the Elden Ring for the age of the Erd Tree, sealing the fate of gods and men. After his defeat, the path to the Elden Ring is clear. By touching the golden light, your Tarnished is transported to the inside of the Erd Tree and witnesses the truth that have been shown all along. Queen Marika the Eternal has been crucified on a golden rune arc. Her punishment for shattering the Elden Ring, the sacrifice she made to collapse the order she created. As the rune arc breaks around her wrists, she falls to the ground, and then, in a flash of light, she transforms into her other self, Radagon of the Golden Order, the second Elden Lord, her Leal Hound, who set everything in order for your Tarnished to make it here, who repaired the Elden Ring while Marika shattered it, so your Tarnished could reforge the world anew. She was never just Marika. When Radagon is slain, the shadows within the husk of his body that once held the Elden Ring leak out, and the vassal of the greater will and living incarnation of order, the Elden Beast, is freed from the shadows. The god that was is reforged into a sword, and a current of primeval energy is unleashed, the arena changing from inside of the Erd Tree to the heavenly sphere from beyond. The light of the sun low in the horizon, the sky full of stars, and pillars of gold stretching as far as the eye can see. As the final fight in Elden Ring, most players should have upgraded their Tarnished weapons to its maximum using an ancient dragon smithing stone, a scale from the ancient Dragon Lord, the Elden Lord of the age before the Erd Trees, the Elden Lord before Godfrey. In a time long past, the oldest and vilest dragon of them all, the tyrant Baal the Dread, turned on the Dragon Lord Placidusax to end his reign and maintain his dreadful rule. Although the Dragon King's power was that of primeval lightning, their battle left both Lord and Tyrant mortally wounded. So the Dragon Lord retreated to his seat at the heart of the storm beyond time. Though, what is a Lord without a god? Once his god was fled, the Lord continued to await its return. And in doing so, the days of his realm's reign grew shorter, until the gloam of twilight took hold. Eternally dwelling beyond time, the gravel-stone scales of the ancient Dragon Lord which granted him immortality also lightly twists time, allowing for the creation of a weapon capable of slaying a god. Smithing Master Hugh of the Round Table Hold was tasked by the Eternal Queen to smith a god-slaying weapon, for which he has done so tirelessly. To fulfill his promise to Marika, that weapon is crafted for your Tarnished. Masterpiece in hand, as the Elden Beast falls, the banner God Slain appears across the screen. The power of the Dragon Lord's gravelstone scales, the power of primeval lightning, lightly twists time, causing the Elden Beast to revert back into the Elden Ring, as well as undoing the reforging, death, and transformation of Marika, leaving the fight that just transpired to only exist in memory. Having been freed from her imprisonment, as she always planned to be, your Tarnished is given a choice. If they played the Game of Thrones and have runes to mend the Elden Ring, your Tarnished can touch the fractured Marika and in a flash of light bring about a new age and a new order. If you were convinced by an ascetic who could see all for what it was and all that it could be, determined that a world built purely on causality and regression was perfect, then you could choose the Age of Order to maintain the Golden Order in perpetuity. If you were compelled by an ancient dragon in the form of a priestess that what is dead may never die, then you could choose the age of the Duskborn, to resurrect the fated realm of the soulless sun and embed the principle of life within death into order. And if you found that the depraved and vile acts of the loathsome should be brought onto the world's children, grandchildren, and every generation hence to make all equal in suffering and torment, you could choose the blessing of despair, to curse the world with horns sent to defile all souls. Or, if none of those options seemed appealing, your tarnished could rule over an age of fracture, an empty vessel for a broken world. There is no happy choice, only one less grievous than the others. However, nothing truly lasts forever. These ages and these orders are just the backdrop to the eternal war. If you had no interest in the Game of Thrones, perhaps you were tempted by the Song of Ice and Fire. In 1923, Robert Frost penned the poem Fire and Ice to explore the idea of how the world might end. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. After enduring every obstacle, enduring every defeat, enduring every tragedy, hardship, and loss, you could have your tarnished inherit the flame of frenzy and melt it all away. Perhaps to save a friend they loved. You could strip your tarnished of their identity, their history, their memories. Your tarnished could become the lord of frenzied flame, even if it meant breaking her heart. A lord that would end all life, destroy all souls, and extinguish all thought, take away all pain, prevent all suffering. A lord of cinder and ash. The tarnished would be no more, and in a flash of light, the lands between wouldn't be either. Fire consumes. It consumes, and when it is done, there is nothing left. Nothing. As the flames of chaos consumes all, your tarnished's faithful steed would burn away into nothing. And Melina, having learned who she was, would peer into your eyes with a vortex of dusk, regret, and wrath. Perhaps, even after your crimes, there will be repose for your soul. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. Long ago, the Nox invoked the ire of the greater will and were banished deep underground. Now they live under a false night sky, an eternal anticipation of their liege, of their coming age of stars, and their lord of night. Through mimicry and treachery, beneath a world of their mother's making, you could be lured into having your tarnished become this lord of night. With America's body dissipating into golden dust, a new vessel is required for the Elden Ring. So one of her last surviving children, her soul preserved in a puppet, will call the cold a cold, dark moon, the only vault great enough for order. With the Elden Ring imprisoned in ice and frost, the lands between would be thrust into a 1,000-year winter. With no sun and no light, a chill night will encompass all, reaching the great beyond. The world above would journey into fear, doubt, and loneliness. Where fire consumes, cold preserves. Only those accustomed to the dark would survive in the face of utter scarcity. Only those cloaked in icy tempests or a false night would live on. Only the songs of shamans in an Eden beneath the earth would last into the future. As the path stretches into darkness, the only two to continue on this voyage, with the memory of the world that was, the only people with the faintest clue of what an Elden Ring is or what it could do, would be your tarnished and their cold, unfeeling, peculiar doll, forever and ever. All else would be sacrifices for the winds of winter. No happy choices and no happy endings. Then, one last choice. begin Journey 2?
What does he want?
An endless night. He wants to erase this world, and I am its memory.
Well, that's what death is, isn't it? Forgetting.
The fallen leaves tell a story. And one other, whom grace would again bless. A tarnished of no renown. Cross the fog to the lands between.
In solitude, the Black Swordsman stood.
To stand before the Elden Ring. And become the Elden Lord.